Is the sound okay and clear?
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly.
Great.
So, welcome parents and guardians to this meeting, and thank you for joining us here tonight. At EduVision, we've heard through your various messages and calls how the delay in the OC and selective exams have caused many students and their families great distress. We've hence prepared a seminar today to help support you in these stressful times. During this period of uncertainty, we'd like to gather together as a community to support one another and wish your child the best in their academic journey. This is a time where your children need you the most, so helping them calmly navigate the situation, both mentally and emotionally, is very important. Please remember, whilst these exams are important, they're not the only determining factor in your child's education. At the end of the day, your children's efforts, dedication, and their ambition are more important than any test score. The topics covered today will help mainly parents process the situation, as well as helping understand a child's psychological state during this process, how to build mental resilience, and how to make the best out of a bad situation. Whilst what happened is unfortunate, we hope to bring some optimism into the conversation and restore your peace of mind. Again, I'd like to wish your children all the best in their endeavors, no matter what they may be. If you have any questions at any point during the meeting, please message us in the chat box below. Questions will be answered in the Q&A section. I'll now hand over to Mohan Dhall, who will be diving deeper into today's topics.
Thank you very much. And we've already had a couple of questions, and the questions are forward-looking. How to improve test scores. All right. So what I'm going to do is look at where we are now and what we can do to empower ourselves. Whilst there are children here, a lot of this will be directed at parents to assist their children, and it will benefit the children enormously if what's said tonight can be shared in an appropriate forum with them if they're not here. So let's have a look. You're coming into a situation where there's been an unfortunate event, and that unfortunate event no one predicted. And of course, when this happens, we're all trying to come to terms with exactly what has occurred and how we can best move forward. Now, the first thing we do, there's a few levels to what we need to do. All right. So let's start with there's some confusion and some stress that has been there, and there's a need to try and resolve that and then move on and make the best of a situation in the way that we can actually control things. So what we need to do is come to terms with the unexpected. We need to assist children to understand what's happened. We need to understand how our anxiety as adults or parents can actually amplify children's stress, so how we can manage ourselves distinct from our children, and then how we can support our children to manage their own anxiety as distinct from ours, and then how to take advantage of the time remaining between now and when the rescheduled tests occur. So there's something you need to know quite distinct from what happened on Friday. So distinct from what happened on Friday is that for the first time you have a group of students being tested universally online. So many of them have prepared in the past in written form. Many are more comfortable in written form. And there's the cognitive adaptation to online testing in an actual test situation. Now, I know also many people have also prepared for online tests, but they've never actually been tested in an online forum as robustly as this test would test them. So there's stress because there's that singular unknown as distinct from what happened on Friday. There are also other unknowns. For example, when will the rescheduled test be and where? How will it be run? And there's all these other sort of procedural things that can cause people stress because they'd like to know. And typically with very bright children, when things are clearly defined, clearly explained, and have limits, then that makes us feel safer. Separately, there was always a question in some parents' minds as to whether there was an advantage of having had exposure to the test on Friday, notwithstanding that there were disruptions, and whether there's some benefit in delaying and having been scheduled for the Saturday or later, Sunday. So there's that uncertainty as well. When would have been the best time to take the test? Would it have been early or late? The scale of the test itself can also be quite daunting for children. It's been observed by educators since ever there has been exams, that there's a proportion of children for whom, when there are lots of other children around being tested, they pick up on the stress of that situation and the anxiety of others, and that amplifies their own stress. So when you have 1,500 people coming to a centre, then the general agitation and movement and uncertainty around where to sit and where to go, it's the first time, that can also make children who are very attuned to how others feel quite anxious, arising simply from those externalities. And then we also know, because parents are very caring and well planned, there's some children travelled to centres quite early. They got there early, they waited a long time, they were hungry, etc. So there's a physical management of, being fed and watered and, hydrated and things like that. So all of those are quite distinct from what happened on Friday. It is a stressful situation of itself. And of course, that situation was amplified by what happened on Friday in a couple of centres. So, what about the unexpected things? Now, we've seen some very unexpected things in the past 5 years. We all had to contend with COVID, and the children sitting for these tests were first exposed to online learning and online testing as a routine. Coming to terms with that was stressful for all of us, but we all adapted. And in fact, since then, it's been really interesting to see how families now have accommodated that we can learn online quite well, we can have greater autonomy, and unexpected things carry certain stresses, but also carry certain opportunities as well. So the factors that have impacted us on this unexpected thing are the tests starting late or finishing late, then being postponed, or what looked like cancelled and then postponed, the test needing to be redone, and whether you should take an option to redo it if you're given that option, and the media coverage and the uncertainty around that, and generally the lack of certainty. So all of these things are normal. They're all quite predictable, and they've all been things that many of us have been through before, but in different circumstances. And there seem to be more regular periods of uncertainty. And so teaching kids how to be robust and resilient, since that's inevitable, there will be uncertainty, is a really, really, really good idea. And we'll go through some of the strategies that we can embed in the way we teach our children and manage them now in the next little period. So the first thing you need to ask yourself is this, and I'm going to stop sharing to say this. When I talk to parents, many parents will say, how do I stop my child from being anxious around tests? I tell them to calm down. How do I stop them from being anxious? So I encourage them and I say to them, everything will be fine, but it doesn't take away their anxiety. And I say, because the anxiety hasn't been actually addressed. And I'll also say to them this, we don't just manage anxiety around one test, we manage an issue around stress to do with performance forever. Because sometimes there aren't tests, but there are other forms of performance, like a job review, like a sporting contest where we may not be confident because that's not our thing, where there might be a musical exam or performance, or a play or a speech or something like that. So the common underlying thing here is bright kids being assessed carry stress and we'd like them to be robust and adaptable, given that there are uncertainties. And uncertainties can also happen in different things. Some of you would know that weather events have impacted on sporting competitions where kids would have been preparing as well, and they've been postponed. That's happened to me twice in the last 6 months with sporting contests, simply because of heavy rain. So now let's go back and ask ourselves, this is one example, an unusual example, but one example of where we need to make the best of something and find a way to take learnings that are lifelong from it. So now let's go back. So you might have questions that you could broadly divide into two categories. One might be questions that are administrative. For example, if my child has done the test and they then redo it, well, does that mean that they'll get the better score or the lower score? Well, good question. That's an appropriate question to have, and it's an appropriate uncertainty. You might wonder something like this. Would the test change now that there's been some exposure? Because if some children have done the test, given the nature of online forums, does it mean the next iterations that come will be the same or different? Or what are the implications of this? That's an administrative question about the test. I can tell you now, from having done some work with NESA, having had students at school who've been subject to great disadvantage for various reasons, for example, a fire in a school, a bushfire in a community where people couldn't do HSC exams, IT outages affecting NAPLAN, etc. These things are quite predictable that around testing dates, there can be things that occur that suddenly subvert the process. My experience with all of these events and with every single time disadvantaged students have had to do stressful things where there was uncertainty and the authority knows it, is that there is always some accommodation. In other words, there is a no disadvantage rule that I've always seen apply. That is, they take into account the circumstances as a moderation. So I haven't seen that any redone test, any adapted instrument, any kids who've done the test and don't resit it, I have never seen disadvantage ever. And we also saw this from COVID when we were worried about the HSC cohort, and there was no distinction despite great disruption and great stress and accommodation. So the first thing you can probably be reassured by is that there'll be a generally applied no disadvantage rule. Okay, it's understood there's been a big stress. It's understood there's been big disruption. It's known that families are upset and accommodating an adjustment, and that will be taken into account and there'll be moderation for it. And I can say that because I've experienced that as someone who has had students go through tests and have seen that there has been no disadvantage when this has occurred. So now let's get to the things that where we might perceive there is a disadvantage. And that might be around the psychology or the emotion relating to this situation. How do I help my child and myself adjust to the change? How can I manage my child's stress levels? And what do I do with the time that I've got between now and an adjusted test or a second test? So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to check the chat, see if there's any questions arising. And if not, then I will continue. So let's have a look at the chat. I don't see any questions or queries or comments, so I'm going to continue. Remember, at any time, if you do want to contribute or say something or ask questions or share, please do so through the chat, and there'll be things that I'll weave in coming from what you say. Ask or contribute. Okay, so the first thing, and this is mainly for parents, okay? Whether we like it or not, parent anxiety can directly impact on child anxiety. So if we are venting about how useless the authorities are, if we're venting about how stressful the situation was, if we're not managing ourselves in front of children, then we're actually amplifying their anxiety. So the first thing we need to do as adults, and I'm talking to the adults, is manage ourselves as adults and separate from and distinct from the children, from the students who are directly impacted. And I'm going to give you strategies for that and then strategies for managing children, assuming that the first one, the managing of the adults, is done separately from managing the children. All right? So let's have a look at managing the adults first. So the first thing we absolutely know is that when there's something unexpected, there's likely to be a secondary emotion of anger. Okay, we feel angry, we feel powerless. We would like to restore a situation. We feel protective of our children. We didn't want them to go through stress or confusion. We might lose trust in the provider and not really trust, what's happening or, does the deity know what it's doing? We could feel devalued because our voices aren't individually heard. And we could feel a bit bewildered, like how could this even happen? And, trying to come to terms with that and have little faith in what's going to happen next. So we're going to be a little bit guarded next time we come to the testing situation. Well, all of those can be named. All of them can be quantified. All of them can be understood. But all of them are to be managed by adults with other adults. In other words, it's okay for me to say to a partner or a friend, I can go and have some time with them, distinct from my children, and vent about how terrible it was, and get it off my chest and get it out. Then I'm in a far better space to both manage what I need to manage regarding that. So if I feel my child has a disadvantage because they did the test, how am I going to manage that with a clear head, not sort of clouded by anger? And also, how can I best help my children to manage their confusion or their sense of uncertainty? So let's just really be cautious to not vent or devalue the authorities in front of the children, however powerfully we feel about whatever has happened. Okay, that's super important and is actually a form of self-empowerment to have that level of control. Okay, no comment yet, so I will continue. So the first thing we do is we acknowledge our feelings. Now, if you're feeling angry, yes, anger is what's called a secondary emotion. So normally there's something that we call a primary emotion underneath it. And that primary emotion could be a feeling of powerlessness, a feeling of protectiveness for our children, a feeling of great disappointment, because, everything had prepared for a point, you've prepared your children, and suddenly that's removed. Then there'll be a feeling of being let down. And all of these sorts of things are legitimate to feel. They're normal. But your children don't need to know how you feel. They've got their own things to manage. So, with respect, if you can, keep how you feel separate from how they feel, because then we can best manage how they feel. Now, it's also important not to catastrophize. Nothing is unmanageable. And in fact, it's super important from a resilience point of view that we quickly regroup as adults and say, right, it's not the best, but what are we going to do about it? And you can make light of it after, the stress has gone and say, great, that was an unexpected thing. That was a little hill that became a mountain that we didn't expect, but we're on the other side of that. Now let's see where we are. It's very important not to catastrophize and not to whip up greater things because it's past, it's gone, and we need to now deal with what we're left with. Worsening a situation is not helpful. It's not mature. It's not beneficial. It doesn't help anyone. I heard that some people given the opportunity to reattempt the selective test while others, that's right. How can this be considered a fair and reasonable assessment in a competitive environment? So that's a fair question, right? You'd expect all people to do tests at the same time. So you can ask, if someone has been exposed to the test and then they get a second chance to be exposed to it and others haven't been, well, how can that be fair? So let's be real, okay? I go down to a shopping centre and I get milk out of a fridge and I'm the first one to get it, so it's freshest. Is it fair that there's someone behind me? And you go, well, it can't be compared. But what we're trying to do is question whether there's such a thing as perfect equality or whether there are things that are fair and reasonable for us to adapt to, given that it was always going to be over 3 days, which is real. So we need to be careful not to assume that fairness means absolute perfect equality, instant, simultaneous things happening for every person under every circumstance. That's actually not resilient. Like, that's not what we're trying to role model here. We need to trust that our children, if they're on a second day or a third day of testing, well, they've had more time. So people who go first are going to say, but they had more time, that's unfair. Others are going to say, but a kid was exposed to a test, and that's unfair. So they've had an example of test conditions, but they've also had the possibility of that being taken away from them and the anxiety afterwards of being picked up. And that's kind of shaped an experience for them, which isn't the same. So we need to be careful about saying, is there an idea of perfect fairness? And I think we need to accept that we'd like the greatest level of sameness within what is reasonable, given that every testing center looks different, the lighting will be different, the clocks will be arranged in different places, the size of desks might vary, the color of carpet might vary, the outside ambient noise might vary. Like, no one is going to have an identical circumstance. This is how it is. So we need to have reasonable accommodation of what we expect to be reasonable. It's fair to ask, but it's also fair to query what we think and to say, are we asking for something that is not reasonable given the scale? So it's not ideal, but it still might be reasonable to have some people do things slightly differently to others. Okay, now we get to children. And this is super, super, super important. Okay. The easiest way to manage children is when we're not conflating managing them with managing ourselves. I'll give you an example. It's going to be an analogy, but it's an example to make a point. Then we'll come back to this. Suppose that I have a child who comes home from school and says they've been bullied. My first thing as a protective parent is to want to march down the school and tell everyone off, blah, blah, blah. My feeling of protection doesn't change if I take 5 minutes to listen to my child. My feeling of needing to protect my child doesn't change if I take 10 minutes or if I wait the next day. I'm still highly protective and wanting to know that my child is safe in school. So now the question is, me marching down there and waving a banner and shouting, is it the best thing for my child to see? Or do I need to manage myself first and then manage my child, knowing that the fundamental thing is I'm going to be protective of my child and give them the best experience they can have, and they're not going to be bullied. So now we come to this. Assuming that we have managed ourselves, assuming we have, then the next thing we do is we manage our children. Now, some children aren't that affected. Some children, I can guarantee you, are like, wow, great, I've got extra time. This is awesome. Great. Not every child is going to be stressed. Not every child is thinking that it's a huge hassle. Some are quite relieved. But I'm interested in those who are troubled because I know that if they're anxious or they're feeling confused or stressed, that can absolutely impact on how they test. So we need to try and calm that emotion so they test their best and they don't bring that anxiety to the test. So just to answer a procedural question that's come in, your child's exam has been postponed. Uh, she asked me, because it is delayed, will it be difficult? No, the answer is absolutely not. It's the same test, simply move forward in time. Okay? So absolutely you can give your child reassurance that it absolutely won't be more difficult through it being delayed, if that's what the question's asking me. Just because it is delayed, will it be difficult? She asked me, just because? No. Because a child is at no fault for cancellation, how can mark children with different questions in the same level for an exam that has been the question with different. Okay, so that's a testing design question for Cambridge. When you do test items, so I've got to do this. I have to manage students who do the HSC or the trial HSC, and they're doing an assessment item that's going to impact on their future. But some are sick on the day, so they do a second item. So the question is, how do you write items of equal validity? Well, that's a validity and a reliability question, which people who design assessment items know. So they make multiple items simultaneously, mapped to similar standards and mapped to similar criteria in terms of what we're saying about the type of thinking. So I'm pretty confident that all iterations of the test will be of similar difficulty or ease, and all will be of similar a capacity to be done by the same cohort, regardless of, you could mix them on any day and every child would have a similar experience of the test itself. If moderation is done, which again, no mistake of child, how this much it can be fair, because there is no software tool found yet to moderate every child. No. So moderation is about removing, if you can, the effects of a disadvantage. So if you look at the cohort that was on Friday who completed the test, and if all of their test scores, or when they redid it, were lower than everyone else, then you might say, well, that cohort has been affected, so we will now average their scores up, because you wouldn't expect that pattern. So that's what we mean by moderation. There's various statistical methods by which you assess whether averages have been changed or whether there's a clear distinction between how kids did at one point in time to another, and whether there's been a negative or deleterious effect of that, and then you moderate for that. My son is very demotivated. What studying? Yeah, we'll get to that later. I recommend giving the example of how kids were sick on the day of the test did the replacement exams. Exactly. The assessment outcomes may vary depending on the day, the students did the test. How can this be considered? Yeah, okay. So we know that on any instrument, on any instrument, there can be people who are sick. So on a selective scores test or an OC test, they can be sick on the day. And children who are sick can do a replacement exam. And there is no disadvantage in doing a replacement test because they're all mapped to the same standards. So that's the point being made. Is it normal to feel quite angry that the test has been delayed? Yes, of course it would be, because if we're preparing for something, so I do address this later and I'm going to come to it, but yes, it is very normal. Okay. And yes, people want to do it as soon as possible because there's been a lot of preparation. But I think if there is a couple of weeks in between, it's probably wise, because we need to just come to terms with it, gather ourselves, and then move on. Just wanted to check if the timer ticking on individual child system, why are the invigilators stopping kids at the end of their watch? We have noted a few parents complaining as the kid was asked to stop, although the kid's computer reflected 2 to 3 minutes more. Okay, that is a administrative one. That's a procedural one. I don't know about that question. I would assume that all tests start at the same time and they then all finish at the same time. And because the software is so good, it would be tracking the exact length of time the child has done the test. So whilst people have their perceptions, whether those perceptions as communicated by a child are reality or not, I can't comment. I don't know about whether a day has been reset yet, but I'm sure you'll be informed very well, very quickly as soon as it has been decided. Okay, so now back to where we were. So the first thing to do with your children, okay, they say, I feel demotivated, or they don't. They might say nothing. Then it's up to a parent to be able to articulate how a child might feel. So it's okay to say to your child, that would have been really confusing and stressful. Or you could say to a child, you feel uncertain. Okay, you feel a little bit anxious. You really don't know what to expect. Now, when I say this to parents, they typically respond with, oh, but I can't say that. I don't know how they're feeling. Well, yes, you probably do know how they're feeling. And in fact, I would argue it's our duty as adults to have a pretty good approximation of how someone might feel in a circumstance where there's been a big change. So do not make your child an unknown, would be my general thing. I'd say make them feel known and give them the language of resilience, which is a language of feelings first. Because the best way to be resilient is to understand how we might feel in a situation and then to learn how to manage how we likely feel in a situation. But not being able to name it or saying, oh, but my child, I don't know how they feel, they haven't told me. Well, I don't think that's the best approach because it doesn't model knowing how someone would feel in a situation where it's fairly predictable how they likely feel. So just to clarify one thing, if I level with feelings, I'm not agreeing with those feelings. So if I say, I understand you feel really anxious, I'm not saying that I'm agreeing that you should be anxious. I'm saying, I understand how you feel. If I say it would have been really confusing, I'm not saying I'm confused. I'm not saying you have to be confused. I'm saying these are feelings people go through. So understanding feelings and validating them does not mean you're agreeing with those feelings. It means that's how the person is feeling. Secondly, I've heard parents say to me, oh, but if I say my child is anxious, then I'm talking negatively to them. Right. If I pretend they don't feel anxiety, I'm actually robbing them of the right to feel, which is probably far worse than normalizing what's real. So you'll notice this. Parents and teachers will say to their children, it's only a test, don't be scared. Yet if you put them in the same situation, they would be scared. So it's not helpful to say, just calm down, because they're not calm. It's better to say something like, okay, let's just breathe slowly and let's talk. Because that's not a critique. It's not negative to feel stressed. What we need is validation and we need to know who we are because resilience comes from being real and managing reality, not pretending real doesn't exist because you're so strong you never feel stress. Well, it's okay to be anxious. Normal people feel anxious. Normal people who are anxious but can manage it do their best in tests. So what's wrong with anxiety? It's about when the anxiety becomes too great that it becomes crippling, that's a problem. So we need to be real about how we feel and help kids manage it. Leveling feelings doesn't make children weaker. Leveling feelings, teaching kids the language of feelings, actually makes them stronger because they become more self-understanding and more capable of learning how to manage feelings that are real, not just having vague sorts of things they don't understand, but understanding when I have that queasiness in my tummy, I know that what I'm doing matters to me and my parents. I know that I feel anxious. And I remember now, when I feel anxious, I have to remember to breathe. And I try and slow my breathing down. And I'll think more clearly. And I'll do my best. Like, that's okay. That's the basis of resilience. I'm going to pause there. So I'm going to stop sharing. And then I'm going to continue if there are any questions. So I'll just stop sharing. Okay, so do I think the coming test will be online or paper? I would have thought it would be online. I wouldn't see the need to go back to paper-based testing. The commitment has been made. The issue wasn't with the whether it was a paper-based test or an online test. The issue was the scale and some of the provisions around managing movement of people. So the nature of the test isn't the issue, or so I don't think it's going to suddenly change back. Any other queries before we go on? Please, by all means, send messages in the chat if you like, and they can be direct. They don't have to be public if you like as well. Okay, so back to sharing. Okay, so let's be real. A lot of people feel a bit angry and we feel a little bit disempowered. So to feel empowered, we need a plan of action. So we say to ourselves, look, this happened, wasn't what was wanted, but the best thing we can do is role model to our children taking responsibility to turn a negative situation into the most positive one we can. So, one thing people do is they kind of turn the event into a bit of humor if they can, or at some point aim to do so because that will mean it's packaged and it can be seen for what it is, which was unfortunate, but we've moved on. So the goal would be to try at some point to say, can we actually shrug that off or put it in its place? So that's the goal. But in any case, we need a plan of action. So what do you do? Well, if your child did the test and you perceive they might be disadvantaged, or you perceive they might be disadvantaged with a future test because they were expecting to have done it and they haven't, well, why don't you write to the DET? My experience has been people who write to the DET feel like they've been able to have their say. And my experience has been from government authorities when there's been a situation like this, is that there's no impact on the child that's negative by virtue of saying, this is what has occurred. Like they're not going to bully your child or suddenly make them miss out by virtue of you writing to them, because all you're saying is saying, this has been the effect. You're not asking for anything, you're simply leveling. Having a test in a large, yeah, but here's something you need to know, right? So I'm going to read the message, but I'm not going to say who it's from, but I'm going to tell you how you must understand this. Having the test in a large testing center is a disadvantage. Yes, but since every kid is having a test in a large testing center, they're all equally disadvantaged. This is super important, right? A kid comes across a tough question, right? And they can catastrophize and go, oh my God, I can't do this. Oh dear, like, oh, I'm so stressed. I knew that I'd get a harder question because the test has been postponed. Well, hang on a second. You're going to get a hard question in the first test that you couldn't have done. So let's see how we're thinking. The thinking is there will be questions in any test you do that are hard. What's your first step? The first step you say, wow, that's a hard question. And then the second step you say is, everybody doing this test will find that question hard. It's normal. Everyone doing this test is doing it online. Okay, so that one anxiety is common to everybody. Everyone coming to a large testing center. Well, okay, that's not a point of distinction. It's common to everybody. So now what you do is you don't make that a point of stress. You say, let's just normalize, look at what we've got and answer it. It makes me wonder the reason is offering a retest. Do you think we should do the retest? Well, if you feel better about doing the retest, there's always a no disadvantage rule applied. In other words, you, you normally the situation is you can't do worse if you do the second test. So if you've done one and then you do the second one, then you can't be worse off. You choose the best of the two. Which version of the test will be offered? There is 4 versions that we know of: Friday, Saturday, Sunday, 19th for children who are sick. Will there be another set of versions created? Well, I would expect that the ones not being used will be used. Why would you create new versions when some haven't yet been run? Assuming the test is secure, and I think these things are extremely secure, then you wouldn't now create another new test for the purpose of for all days if 2 of them have never been used before. Maybe a very generic question. Yeah, the very generic question. My comments in the Sydney Morning Herald relate to public entities using private providers. And I always have the same line, whether it's healthcare or education. I don't think there should be a privatization of public health things or public education things. So, yes, there should be an inquiry into any private provider providing for a public thing, and there should be more openness. Okay, so I've got no problem with private providers supporting private businesses. I think that's absolutely appropriate. That's how the commercial market works. The question is public providers using public government authorities using private providers, that's something I've got a personal issue with because I like more accountability around the provision of public services as a taxpayer. Is it really important to attend a selective school? No, it's important that you have the best education you can have, whether it's in a selective school, a single gender school, a co-educational school, a private school, a religious school. It's to get the best education we can, regardless of school. Is there a make-up test available if a student misses the upcoming exam because they were sick? Um, there are always provisions made for people who have unfortunate circumstances. There is always some accommodation. So that would be something that you'd need to check if that was the situation. My school camp is happening during when the selective tests are being held. If I get allocated a day where it is closed, should I go to the camp or stay at home and prepare? I'd like to hear your thoughts. Well, what do you value more? And what do you think your child would benefit most from? So school camp is a great opportunity to be with cohort. It's very good for socialization and to learn skills. Doing a selective test is a great opportunity to have an experience around testing, to have a go at entering a system. If you think your child is likely to get in on the test, then that's a different calculation to if you're doing it speculatively. Speculatively, individual circumstances vary, so I can't comment on what you should do, but there are different things that you'd be weighing up around what you do. I'd be consulting the school and asking them, my kid's school is scheduled for Canberra Camp in the week after. To avoid the new test date being scheduled to the same day, would it be help to write to the Department of Education requesting to avoid these days? Well, yes, you can write to the Department of Education. You could also discuss it with your school. Will the test that people at other centres did on Friday be the same test that the people whose test got postponed will do? Now, that's a very good question. Generally speaking, if a test has been given and therefore is in inverted commas in the public domain. Now, when I say in the public domain, it isn't available, but people go onto chat forums and they discuss things and they ask questions, and there could be a perception around an advantage if something that has been already done is then discussed. So I would pretty much expect that there'd be a different test done. Will there be a delay on the release of the results? Well, when things are done electronically, other than written components, they're quite quick to mark. There may be a delay on the release of the results, but I don't know. Best practice says the quickest turnaround between when a test is done and the release of the results is best practice. Is the selective high school test placement test adaptive? That's a very good question. So I don't know the answer to that. And that's a question really for the test designer and the test host. So it is a very good question, though. We know that NAPLAN is. So the question is a selective high school placement test adaptive? I haven't heard that it is, but it is a fair question to ask, is it? It would seem odd if it were, because they're not measuring, NAPLAN measures basic literacy and numeracy. And to be adaptive means you can give nuanced information that informs schools about how to help kids best and also inform parents. The selective schools instrument is a different type of instrument, so it would have different things in it, but I'm unsure about whether it would be adaptive or not, or whether it would be helpful to be. It would be unusual for this sort of test to be adaptive at this stage. Look, certainly, Kerry, I'm going to address this issue around losing momentum and how to get that back. So let's move on. Okay, so there's been a time delay, and several people have referred to this. My child was ready, and now they've been a bit subverted by the delay. So anyone who does something that they've been preparing for, all of our focus and all of our time and all of our energy has been affixed to a point in time, or in this case, 3 days, somewhere across 3 days. And there is a notion of peaking. I've done all my preparation, I've done my final things, I've done what I can. Then how do I now pick myself up and redo it? Good question. So what would you have done? Like, let's take a completely different example and say, let's suppose all the nails that fell on the M4 that same morning, on the M1, from people coming down from Newcastle, they couldn't go through the road because hundreds of cars had damaged tyres. So let's suppose on the way to the testing centre, there's a massive power outage and, lights went down, the traffic jams everywhere, and no one could get there on time. And they then postponed the test, right? Okay. So I was ready, and now there's been a disaster and I can't be there. So it's extrinsic. It's not something we could have prepared for. It's not something we expected. It's not something we wanted. What do we do? So in this situation, we need to be disciplined and we need to model resilience. So I'm giving you a 4-step plan. And the 4-step plan I talk about is called talking into, acting through a plan, including your child, and graduating or staging what you do. Okay, a 4-step plan. I'll come to the questions in a moment. I'll just go through this 4-step plan. So number 1, talking into. So the first thing you do, you've talked about some of the stress and anxiety that's come down. You've heard your child. They've calmed somewhat. And now you're at the stage where we do what we call problem solving. Okay, so we're up to the problem solving stage, which is the stage when we need to act, to have a plan and to act. So what we need as parents first is something distinct from what we bring to our children. So we say, what's our plan? We've got 2 weeks, a couple of weeks. There's a camp. We need to address that with the school. That's one part of a plan. Um, you know, we need some certainty. We might want to write to the DET, and we want to have a plan around how we get to a venue and things like that. We need a plan. As soon as you have a plan, you're demonstrating that you've got confidence and you're pulling power back to you. Okay? And that's super important. When we feel disempowered, we need to do things that empower. So this is a critical thinking task. This is a task for us to model resilience and critical thinking. So we empower. So we need a plan. So you look at when the testing date could be or will be. You then say, what are we going to do? So we've got a child who's feeling a bit dispirited or demotivated. We need them to quickly regroup. So we need to be confident and happy and see this as a challenge. We need to come to this with a sense of purpose and a sense of self-definition. This will not beat us. We can do this. This is great. Everyone has been thrown out. So now the test is, can we do the test? And also, how quickly can we regroup? Let's play the game. Like, it's up to you to manage that, not to dwell in the valley of angst. So we act through a plan. If I was writing a plan, I'd be drawing it. I'd literally be visualizing it. I'd be saying, there's a test date. Here we are now. Here are the symbols that we're coding. Now, you think through what you're going to do and you think through how you're going to do it. That's step 1. That's what I call talking into. And not just talking into, but also having a plan about what you intend to do, when and how. Then we go to the child and we say, look, man, that was unexpected. Sheesh, but we're here. I want you and me, us, your parents and you, let's do this. Let's have a plan and let's find a way to make this work for you. You're not feeling great now. Tomorrow, you'll feel less ungreat. The day after, you're going to feel a little bit better. Let's have a day or 2 off. Great. But what we can do is show a sense of knowing and purpose and understanding. Today isn't the day to start preparing. Tomorrow might not be, but by about Tuesday, it might be. So we say to your child, look, you need a couple of days off. That was unexpected. We need to just chill for a while. And on Monday night, you can watch a bit of TV instead of do anything too stressful or whatever. We can read together. But on Tuesday, we'll just have a look at a couple of those little problems that we like, but only for 10, 15 minutes. By Saturday, we're pretty much back to normal because what you've done is you've staged or graduated over a period of time. So you have some time off and you build successes through being nice and slow and thoughtful and build success as you go. So one of the best ways to build success is to make sure that when you redo preparation, you start with the things that you know your child does well. Always start with successes. Start with confidence, remind them of what they know, and then you go to the extra time you've got to manage what you can do around the things that they've always struggled with, that you might have a little bit more time now to address. Okay? So I would suggest that four-stage approach. Now, would the kid have advantage in retaking the exam? Would the best score of the two be taken? Typically, typically, you don't get a worse score if you take the option to do it a second time, if you're given that option. Um, I haven't heard of people being penalized. The worst they can do is, so let's say they get a low score now and they get a better score next time, then generally they take the higher score. If they get a score here and they go worse next time, you take the better score anyway. So there's a no disadvantage rule that normally applies. I would expect it to apply in this situation, but I don't know because I'm not the tester. But that is what normally applies in these situations. How are IT-related challenges addressed during the exam? Is there a system in place to track issues such as slow computer response times? Well, I don't know. I don't know that I can answer that. That's a question for the provider. It's a fair question to ask if you've got evidence that that's an issue, but that's a general question that you'd put to the provider or to the DET. Will the level of difficulty in the test be roughly the same? Yes. In terms of test design, absolutely. In fact, I would expect, so think about this, right? If I'm drafting a question. So I'm drafting a question, and I know there are going to be 3 different days when the thing that I'm testing is going to be done. So I'm drafting one question, but at the same time, I'll be drafting a second one and a third one using the same thinking, using the same number of words, slightly changing something about it, but testing similar things. So I would think there would actually be very, very similar tests if you look at the item types, even if they look slightly different. That is unfair for the ones with a second chance. That is unfair for the ones with the second chance, or that is extra fair for the ones with the second chance. Um, yeah, life happens. So the question is, if someone else's child went through what they went to on Friday, let's suppose my child was scheduled to do the test on Saturday. So that child on a Friday might have a second opportunity. So the question then is, should I be angry that the person on Friday gets a second chance, or should I be relieved that my child didn't go through what the children on Friday went through? So you can look at the same situation and you could say, well, that's really unfair. But someone else looking at it will say, well, phew, I dodged a bullet. Like, how lucky was I not to be there on the Friday? So I think we need to be not overly hung up on things about fairness or unfairness or subjectivity around these things. We say, where are we now? What can we reasonably manage? What's the best way to manage our feelings distinct from the children? Because if you think it's unfair, that's fine, but address it with other adults, not with your child. Then, how do we best manage our children? So that's the approach that I'd be having. Will the test be scheduled on different days on OC? I don't know whether any decision has been made about that, so let's see. We should have a level playing ground. Well, yes, as level as can be, given the scale. We've got nearly 19,000 people doing an online test for the first time. Has ever anything first time round ever gone as predicted? Like, I don't know, maybe. But as far as things can be level, I'm sure people are trying to make it level. But that being level means they do the same level of test. But it doesn't mean the circumstances are identical for every single child. As I said earlier, there'll be more sound in one area, there'll be different lighting, there'll be different sized desks, there'll be different colored carpet. Like, who knows? So, like, we need to be resilient enough to say we can accommodate minor things. If the test is largely the same, but it's been postponed by a couple of weeks or 3 weeks, well, great. The test is largely the same for all kids. Will students have harder tests on the retest day? No. Will it be different levels of difficulty on different days? No, I don't expect so. How will they compare the scores with those who took the retest and those who didn't? Well, since you know who took the test, you can easily see whether there was a benefit when they took a second test, so you can easily moderate to remove the benefit. So the thing about moderation is a very, very, very well-known process in academic circles. It's been discussed probably since the 1960s around how we have validity and reliability around test instruments. And moderation looks at whether a test done at one time reliably tested how kids would do at a second point in time on a similar instrument. So it's been known about for 60, 70 years and has been well accommodated. So I think that if someone had done the test on Friday and they get an opportunity to resit, and as a cohort, let's imagine that they all do better the second time round, then you'll simply moderate that cohort so that that advantage has been removed. It's not a hard thing to do. It's actually quite a simple process. So I wouldn't be concerned whether someone whether that might be the case, because I know that there are moderation processes that can accommodate that. Is it better score of the two? Isn't that unfair though? Well, it depends on the individual child. If 10 children did better, but 1,490 didn't do better, then where's the unfairness? So it depends on whether, as a cohort, everyone does better, not in individual cases. But the moderation is not transparent. Okay, so this is a separate question then. And this actual question is both public and private, and it's a fair question, right? So how do we know what moderation takes place? And this happens with the IB, it happens with the HSC, it happens with NAPLAN, it happens with every single test that was ever done that's an external test. It happens with Cambridge. Moderation occurs. Moderation processes are generally not routinely disclosed, but they always have one thing as a premise. Is there fairness? Is there reliability? And is there validity? That's the basic premise of moderation. So if the basic premise of moderation is that, then transparency, assuming moderation is carried out, well, who cares? Because it's a process around fairness. It's a whole process of equity. So I don't have a problem with that. People not being scrutinized over the marking process or something. I don't personally have a problem with that. And I'm very big on accountability in education. Any other questions? Yeah, it is a matter of trust, and you're right. And so the question was, but isn't it a matter of trust? And so that sort of comes back to what I said at the start, that one of the issues that occurs when an authority has a situation like they've had is people do trust less. And, here I am saying, but, there are some aspects of this you can trust. Like, I think you can trust the marking is going to be accurate, especially the electronic marking. I think you can trust uh, moderation processes, but it is appropriate for people to say, but I'm not really trusting. Yeah, that's true. Um, but the system we have is a system we have. If you're taking part in the system, then to take part in it means you are already vesting it with some trust. So, at some point we've got to let go and let be. Um, The delayed cohort consists lots of OC students in good public schools. The average scores are generally higher than the rest of the area of Sydney, with students attending the test already be scaled up of their scores, assuming the lower average. Well, goodness me. I'm not sure whether that's true. I can't verify or not what you've said. If you're saying a whole heap of bright kids from particular schools have already done the test because they were, selected to do it at that time, so there's already a benefit. Well, you know, um, yeah, we're giving one test instrument that's largely similar for all kids, regardless of when it's being done. So I don't think it makes a difference, actually. Does harder questions make my child more prepared for the test? Well, it does two things. So that's a good question. Harder questions can help your child learn how to think in ways, but it can also, depending how hard they are, lead to lower self-esteem and a child believing they can't do things. So it depends how much harder the questions are. Um, if they are reasonably realistic and they can be done within time and they're slightly harder, no problem. If they're unrealistic, if they take way too long, then what's this an exercise in? Making children not feel good? I don't know. So harder questions may or may not make a child more prepared. It depends how much harder, it depends how much longer, etc. Would you be sharing the slides with us? I'm happy to send them through. We heard that the maths test on the second was significantly harder than the first. A quite common feedback. How would they adjust marks? Well, how do you know that? Since different people did it, how can you know that? Apologize if you have answered it already. For students doing retest, is the second test final, or is it among the best amongst the two? Typically, um, typically things like the so the question was typically when someone does a test and then they do a retest and they're allowed to do that, then the the question is, do they take the better of the two marks? And typically they do, because you can't have a loss or a you can't move yourself into a situation where you're being invited to do a retest where you can go worse. So you either get the same score or better. Do I think a particular private provider's contract should be cancelled? I can't comment on whether a private provider's contract should be cancelled, but I can say this, and this is my personal view, and it relates to public entities working with private contractors. I have no problem with private businesses working with private contractors. I think that's, everyone uses specialized services, and I've got absolutely no problem with that. Whether a public entity should outsource to a private provider is a separate question for academics, and I happen to be an academic that thinks that public utilities should be run by a public sector that gives greater public accountability, including for selective tests around test scores and cutoff scores and what was chosen. So I have a general personal belief that I'd prefer public funding and public authorities not use private providers for what they do for building roads or for electricity provision or for, whatever. I would prefer that it be in public hands, but that's my own personal view. That's got nothing to do with the provider in this case. And I don't know what the circumstances were around the provider in this case. Do I believe that the particular test given in various centres is harder than the real OC test? It might surprise you, some of the test items in the selective scores test and in the OC tests are quite straightforward. They're very predictable and quite easy, and some aren't. And so I would assume that you will come across some test items in well-written tests that are slightly harder. You'll come across some test items that are quite predictable, and that's good testing. I don't know if they're harder than the real one because I don't write the real OC test items or the selective test items. And I know the things that I write are harder, but when I write, I'm writing for developing thinking. I'm not writing for developing speed. So you use what materials are given for the purpose they're given. Were the reading passages the same across the days? I don't know. I would have thought they wouldn't do the same passage, but you can give the same passage as long as you ask different questions. So it doesn't matter whether the passage is the same. It matters if the question levels are the same. And I'm not really fixed on whether the actual thing people read are the same. I'm fixed on, is the testing of that material of equal validity and reliability for the different cohorts? Is the last date for change of school choice going to change? It depends when the test results are posted, doesn't it? So I don't know. That's a question for the DET. All right. I don't see. Oh yeah, here we go. Will the test be different to the one that took place on Friday, or will it be the same test with just different formats? Well, that's a really good question. Sometimes what we do is we vary the. So when you're wanting an instrument to be valid and reliable, but not too different, what some test designers do, and I'm not saying that this will be done in this case with this provider, I don't know, but I do know people who have designed tests who will change the order in which the answers are, or will change the wording of some of the answers, but it's a largely similar answer because they know that it maps and is equally valid and reliable. Um, so it could be different formats, I don't know, but I would expect there'd probably be slightly different tests. Do you know if the tests are with the new test paper, how many test papers they're prepared? Well, typically, an authority, when you do a exam that you know is going to be spaced over several days, you design all of them simultaneously. So you design at least 3 papers, and possibly you also do your make-up paper, which is your one for sick, illness, accident, blah, 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 blah. So the answer to how many test papers they prepared, I would assume that probably 4 items, four test papers were prepared. Um, so the yeah, that's what I would expect, but I don't know. Do I think that the person in charge of public education should be sacked or resigned? No, I don't. Um, I don't think that should be the case. I don't see what that purpose that would serve. Um, in fact, the person who's in charge of public education is a big advocate of selective schools and of gifted education, having gone to Fort Street High School. So I think you've got a very good advocate for selective schools in running the public education, running the DET or whatever. So no, I don't. Um, I've got separate questions about whether my own questions in my mind, whether selective schools should be from year seven or not. I think they should probably start from year 10, but that's from an educational perspective. I hold that view. And as someone who's passionately interested about gifted kids who are going to uni, having the best education they can have, and I'm not sure whether being tested down at year 6 is the best form of entry into a selective system or one that's somewhat delayed. Will they reuse a test or a writing? Yeah, they certainly can do that. No problem with that. Every provider does reuse things, but how they reuse them, they don't normally reuse them in identical form, but they do reuse elements of what they've done. Of course, that's appropriate, and that also helps with the reliability aspect of testing. So that's not a bad, from a theoretical perspective around assessment, that's actually not bad at all. Okay, any other questions or queries? Okay, so in summary, what I've said is this, and this is super important. None of us welcomed or wanted what happened on Friday. Everyone was prepared for, a smooth testing experience where there were enough things that were uncertain, moving online, large test centers, and the getting to and from those centers. Whatever happened, happened, and we're here now. The best thing we can do as adults is to manage how we feel distinct from how the children feel and quickly restore ourselves so that we can model the resilience we want to see in our children. The second thing we need to do is listen to our children and level with their feelings and help them discharge the discomfort of what happened and that there's been a delay and manage best what we can between now and the time when the rescheduled tests occur. One way that can be done is through having an action plan, through um, thinking through the steps that you'd have, through slowly bringing your child back to feeling more confident around doing a little bit more work, and through doing practical things like if you feel the need to, writing to the DET, um, so that's a practical thing you can do. You can ask questions, you can talk about disadvantage, and or doing what you can really control, which is how you manage your child and help them to feel resilient. There are predictable things you can do. You can help them learn to manage stress by acknowledging that tests are stressful. You can help them to learn to breathe when they're anxious and identify anxiety. So I think that the best thing we can do is just take stock. It was unfortunate, wasn't the best, but the best thing we can do is to try and model resilience and have a purposeful next series of steps so that whenever your child does a test, they have the best outcome they can have. I appreciate you saying that. That's very nice of you to say. Do I think the test difficulty for writing would be different if the writing question is asking for a narrative, advice sheet, letter? Possibly, possibly, but kids are meant to be across all different types of writing. If all the stimulus of the writing is the same for 2 days, should it be the same for the third day? Well, I don't know. It depends on what they're asking people to do. Having the same stimulus is one thing, but I'm assuming that no child who hasn't done the test has seen the stimulus. So if I told you it was on aeroplanes, would it make any difference to you? You might go, oh yeah, okay, but who cares? Like, you've still got to answer the question. So I wouldn't be overly hung up on things like that. What if it gets posted? Yeah, that would be that would be strange, wouldn't it? Is there any chance for those students who had postponed will be doing the same test paper as makeup? I don't know. That's fine. Look, I hope it's been useful. I know that it has been a very stressful time, and I hope that things are calmer and we can all feel a little bit more purposeful around how we manage from now till when the next test dates are.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mohan, for all of your really valuable insights. I think um, to comment on that, the main takeaway for all parents and for the children that are watching this as well is to remain calm, as calm as we can be, and to understand that while some things may be out of our control, such as you mentioned, the clock placement or um, the moderation of exams or the questions in the test paper, what is important to remember is that no matter the test result, we wish our children the best that they can, and that they try their best no matter what happens. So, for all the parents that are here today, thank you for joining us. I know it was um, quite an unexpected meeting, but also thank you to all the children that attended. And we hope you guys all learnt for something and could get a main takeaway out of tonight. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Mohan, again.
Thank you.
Yeah.
See you all.